Today is July 19th, 2023. We are interviewing Edith Kodmer. My name is Esther Finder. Ms. Kodmer is in La Jolla, California, the United States. I am in Henderson, Nevada, and the language will be English. Thank you for speaking with us today. What is your name and can you please spell it?
Edith, E-D-I-T-H. I use my maiden name as a middle name, Strauss, S-T-R-A-U-S-S. Daddy always said be generous, and my last name is Kodmer, K-O-D-M-U-R.
And what was your name at birth?
Edith Strauss.
Where were you born?
Ludinghausen, Germany.
Could you spell that, please?
L-U umlaut, or in English sometimes an E is put after the U, D-I-N-G-H-A-U-S-E-N. It's in the province of Westfalen in northwestern Germany.
When were you born?
May 8th, 1935.
And how old are you today?
88.
What was your hometown like? Was it a big city or small?
No, a small town, although larger than my mother's, which we may address later, in that it had a train stopping there. And at that time, it was like county seat. It is no longer that, but it was before the war. And there's a Catholic hospital, there are some schools. There was never a Jewish school. A river runs through it. It's really beautiful. It goes back to the 11th, 12th century.
What do you know about relationships between the Jews and their neighbors at that time when you were born?
At that time, everything I've ever heard is that there were good relationships. My grandmother, who was a notable cook, even though she had a lot of servants who did the groundwork, but she would make a big pot of soup that was taken to the Catholic hospital where I was born for the laboring mothers. And I was told on one of my trips, I think in the late 18th, early 19th century for sure, one of the guilds in the town had admitted at least one Jew. So, and you know, everything that my father talked about growing up, and later I'll come to what a neighbor did for my family that he wasn't supposed to do, but he had played with my father as a little boy, and so that loyalty was still there despite the Nazi strictures.
Had your family lived in Germany for many generations?
Yes, I was the fourth generation born in Ludinghausen, but the historian for the town went back to the 1700s, where some of the Strausses were actually in the south of Germany. And well, maybe you don't want to get into my mother's situation. Both towns, my mother's hometown and my hometown, are in the northwest of Germany near the Dutch border. And my mother's grandmother was buried in the Netherlands. And later we'll talk about the fact that my mother's sister married in the Netherlands. And my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was hidden in the Netherlands and survived.
Did you have a large family?
No, that's one of the things I've been thinking about in preparing for this history. All of our lives changed with when Hitler came to power and the rules started coming in. I'm an only child. My cousins, except for one, were all only children. The one who had a brother, the brother was murdered. I would have had brothers and sisters, and I would have had a very large extended family. My father had uncles and aunts in the town and lots of cousins. And in rereading the book about those families, it said the cousins were all very close and came together often. So our lives would have been very different.
What religious traditions did your family observe?
Oh, followed all the holidays. And my paternal grandfather died young because he had diabetes. The nurse lived in the house and all, but in those days, he died in 1920 in his 50s. He, on his deathbed, had his oldest son, Siegfried, promise to become observant, which I guess he hadn't been that observant. So indeed, henceforward, Siegfried kept kosher and went to services every Shabbat and so on. My family was more, we followed Reform, although my parents kept divided dishes, meat separate. We had red and white towels for them to dry the meat dishes and blue and white towels for the milk dishes. And you didn't mix the two. But, and they certainly didn't bring pork or shellfish into the house. But they didn't buy kosher meat,
What was your father's name?
Ernest, and no middle name. My mother had a middle name. Ernest. Actually, in German, it's Ernst, E-R-N-S-T. And he was the baby, the youngest of the three brothers. His oldest brother was named Siegfried, and my mother's one of three. Her older brother was also named Siegfried, very German names. So you can see how German those families, how they identified.
What did your father do for a living?
That area, the nearest kind of city to Ludinghausen, it's like 20 minutes by bus. I did that on an art night where someone took my son and me, where all the monuments are open, all the galleries are open. They do it once a year. It's a wonderful city. It's Münster. And Münster, not Munich, which is in the south of Germany. Münster is a university town, and it's been named most livable city several times in Germany. Same kind of parameters as what we have here in the States. So that area is called Münsterland, the land of Münster. It's very flat. And there are a lot of horses and cattle. And actually, when you drive around, you can smell the cattle. But all of the family, pretty much, and on my mother's side as well, were horse and cattle dealers. My father was, his father had been, his oldest brother was, the middle brother not. The middle brother had gone to the city and had some kind of desk job.
What was your mother's name?
Ruth Rachel, spelled Rahel, Hamburger. And it really is Hamburger. When I'm asked by banks, what's your mother's maiden name? I tell them and I say, no one would make it up. She was the middle child. Her, as I've already said, her older brother Siegfried, a year older, was born 1910, and she was born 1911. They had a baby sister who was like 5 years younger. And sadly, their mother and father, once the war, World War I, was over, took a trip to the city because they hadn't been able to buy clothes or furnishings for the house. And they did all that. Well, Rose, my grandmother, came back with the so-called Spanish flu, the terrible pandemic of 1918, 1919, and she died, leaving a 8-year-old, 7-year-old, and 3-year-old. And my grandfather didn't remarry till after World War II. His sister, also named Rose, who was a maiden lady, came and helped. They also had servants, but she helped with the children. But of course, there was no mother in the house.
What work did your mother do?
Well, my mother was really gifted in many areas, artfully and fashion-wise. She and her sister always had custom-made clothes. And actually, my uncle, who was over 6 feet tall, as is his son, who's like 6'4", my uncle always dressed to the nines as well. In the States, he was known for that. And my mother always looked wonderful. She was really bright, and the family recognized that. And her little town, Furstenau, was even smaller than my father's. And so my grandfather sent her away to school, first by train. I mean, they recognized that she needed more than what was available there. Later, then, in high school, gymnasium in Germany, she was a boarder at a Catholic high school run by the Ursuline sisters. Now, she didn't board in the convent. She boarded with a Jewish widow who had a piano. That part was very, very important. They found her, because she needed the money probably, and that she had the piano for my mother. And then my mother went on to college, and then with the, it's one of the orders with the men. It'll come to me. I was thinking about it yesterday. Jesuits. And she studied some business courses there. But when she left all that schooling, she didn't, what for us I think is a peculiar thing, and I do have pictures of the family. She went to live with a family named Stein, Stone in English, who had 2 young sons. And the little blonde mother was constantly in the hospital, but that woman had more surgeries than you can imagine. She lived to a very old age in the Bay Area, finally. But they were descendants of the grandfather, I think, had discovered a concrete kind of sand pit. And to this day, the descendants are getting money, royalties from that sand pit. Anyway, concrete. Um, Mother was in that household. Suppose she was helping Mrs. Stein. They had other servants. Mother wasn't a servant. She was to learn how to run a household. And my grandfather, the Steins were very wealthy, but my grandfather paid for my mother to have that experience. And that's how my mother met my father. The Steins were distantly related to the Strausses. And one Sunday on a drive, Sunday drive, one of them said, "Oh, I think the Strausses still have that youngest son isn't married. Let's go visit." And my daddy happened to be home. He wasn't always home. He lived actually somewhere else. And he told my mother she had a run in her stocking. But my mother had great legs. And indeed, that began their romance, and they were married in 1934. Now, when they were married, you asked about relationships, and I said they were good. However, my parents did say I have no photographs of an engagement party or their wedding. The only wedding photos I have is from my aunt in the Netherlands, where the whole family is there, and I'll show that later. But my mother said they had to close all the curtains the night they had a party to celebrate the engagement. So 1934, even though they were out in the country, things were not as they had been.
What early memories do you have from Germany? Are there any images in your mind?
Yeah,
some emotions?
only a couple. I have a wonderful memory, but really, I was exactly 3 years old when my family left, and I have a strong memory there are no photographs, and no one's told me about it, so it is a memory. And I must have been 2.5 in the winter, playing with my cousin Walter, who was 4 years older. And I know I really looked up to him and loved him so much. And we were playing outside, but my nose was cold. My hands were, I must have been wearing mittens, but even so, I was so cold, I started crying and I ran inside. That's one memory. And then the only other memory I have is from the ship going to the States, leaving Germany. My daddy, whom I adored all my life, gave me a spanking. And a girl had come and tattled and said I had done, I don't know what it was now, but I hadn't done it. And children have such a strong sense of justice. I really believe I didn't do it. Plus, I was a very well-behaved child. But anyway, those are the only two real memories I have from that period.
When did you leave Germany?
I'm not sure if it was the end of June or beginning of July 1938. The ship, we went to Bremerhaven, Bremen, the harbor for Bremen, which is way north. And I have photos which I'll show. The whole family, both sides, came to see us off. The SS Seattle was the name of the ship. And we arrived in San Francisco, and I know it stopped in Central America, and I guess it's stopped in San Diego. My mother remembers that. But they all went on shipboard or on the deck to see the crossing under the Golden Gate Bridge, which had just been finished, completed. And that was August 29th, 1938. Because the reason I know that, it's on the green cards of my parents that I have. But the next day was my daddy's birthday. And you can imagine with all the turmoil and landing and the relatives greeting us and so on. The next day we were all walking. My Aunt Lena and Uncle Max, Daddy's middle brother. And Daddy and I were apart a bit, and he told me it was his birthday, and I kissed him. And Mother saw that, and she suddenly realized and remembered, oh, it was his birthday. So that's when we arrived, the end of August. And you see September, October, and then November 9th, just barely 2 months and 10 days later, the lives of the rest of the family changed totally with Kristallnacht.
I have 2 questions for you. Who was with you, or was it just you with your parents? And why didn't anybody else come with you?
It was just my parents and me. The middle brother, Max, who had lived in the city, and his wife had emigrated a couple of years before. My Aunt Lena, Max's wife, also grew up in Lüdinghausen, but she had a number of aunts and uncles, Königsheim, and they shortened it to König, king, who were in San Francisco. And they were old people. We visited every High Holy Day. We were all dressed up for services, and then we'd go visit Tante Clara, Uncle Albert, Uncle Tante Frida, Tante Henrietta. And one of those uncles was the signature for our papers. Now, in the book again, I was looking through, all the others were trying. My grandmother signed some papers, but it was way too late. And in fact, when I first saw that piece of paper in Germany, I said to the gal who has organized all this history, I said, I never knew my Oma Julie, Jonah Strauss's middle name was Sarah. And of course, it wasn't Sarah. At that time, the Nazis had all Jewish women assign Sarah as their middle name. And I think the men, Abraham, I'm not sure, but they forced that. But at any rate, she signed some papers. And the cousin, wonderful woman, Daddy's cousin, who arranged for my cousin Alfred, Siegfried's older son, to leave by the Kindertransport, that wonderful program for children who were old enough. He was already 13 or so at that time. And he went to Great Britain. The younger brother was too little, too young to be sent that way. But Lissy arranged that, and she told us that my Oma, my grandmother, begged her to help her get out. But Lissy tried and couldn't. Lissy took her mother to New York, and her mother was Julie, my grandmother's sister. But Lissy couldn't. It was just too late at that point for them to get papers. And over again, the other night when I was going through that book, they all tried, but couldn't. One person was number 52,000 or something on a wait list.
So what was it that made your family leave at that time?
Mother told me a story about a transaction Daddy had made. I don't know if it's horses or cattle. And there was something the Nazis didn't like about it. And she went to my grandfather's somehow to take care of paperwork. And she came back at night and ran through fields back to where they were living. And I later, it's one of the few poems I've ever written, but I wrote a poem about it because I could just imagine the terror that she felt doing this, trying to do this, and then running home in the dark with those men maybe out there for her, waiting for her. So he could no longer really work in his business. And that's what happened to all of them, really. I mean, earlier, one of my best friends growing up was the daughter of an eye surgeon in Berlin. And they had left much earlier. But the doctors and lawyers and university professors were barred from their professions earlier. So what could they do but leave? So in fact, Dr. Bob was like the rabbi for a group, the Council of 1933. So whether they actually came in 1933, but there were the professionals who had come earlier.
When you left Germany, what did you take with you? When I say you, your parents and you personally, what did you take with you?
Obviously, a lot of clothes, and my mother had clothes for me for the next several. They could not take money, and it's ugly in a way. But when my parents went to see her sister's family in the Netherlands in Winterswijk to say goodbye, because they were not only her sister's in-laws but distantly related to my father. They asked my father, well, how much money are you taking with you? And he said, I can't take any. I don't know if he could take 100 marks or $100 or something, but it was a really minimal amount. And they said, you fools, how can you do that? Well, that entire family was killed. The entire family, the little children, everybody. Anyway, one of the things I'm going to show, one of the photographs, I have it upstairs, the trunk. A man in the town in Ludinghausen made 3 trunks, and they're very like Louis Vuitton trunks. There's wood and then canvas for my parents. And at that, Mr. Demling. And I met the family on one of my trips. They've continued with that, contractor and carpenter. And I have a cabinet in the garage that Daddy used for his underwear and things, that solid wood and very heavy, that I know he made. So he was not to work, you were not allowed to do anything for Jewish family or Jews. But he said, his family told me, I have known them all my life. He, I think this is the father whom I didn't meet, played with my father in the street, as little boys. And he was going to do this. But he made the 3 trunks. And I was told all this on, a more recent trip to Germany. He put it on a horse and wagon. And in the middle of the night, midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, he went around Ludinghausen and went to my grandparents' house, where we had been living for my parents and I. Apparently the last 3 months we were living with them. And unloaded it in the courtyard there, where no one could then see it. And I've kept the one trunk. It has paint splatters and all kinds of things, but I can't bear to part with it. And in the book, it does say, that I acknowledge his bravery and loyalty to the family. So that's how they pack. Now, I have laid out, and later we're going to take photos. They're just things. They aren't the people. But there's china and silver and lots that my grandmother gave to my mother. And I kind of wondered, how did all this happen? And now that I know we were living with my grandmother, and at that point, the oldest brother, his wife, and the two boys were living in the family house. You'll see pictures of it. It's a declared national landmark because it's Jugendstil, kind of Art Nouveau craftsman style. And you can't do anything, change the outside. It's the same as our rules here. Anyway, obviously, if we were there in the house with them, it was easy for my grandmother to give my mother these things to pack, which she then, of course, did. Her coffee service, and I had banquet cloths when I packed them. When I moved my mother from San Francisco to here, I really sobbed looking at those banquet cloths. Here were people coming to a strange land with no money, and what were they going to do with banquet cloths, But they didn't know what might be ahead or what was ahead. So they packed what they could. And I saw a wonderful movie about some Jews who went to Africa, and the husband was furious when they unpacked because the wife had brought her, and I'm not sure whether they were Jewish, I guess they were, her Rosenthal china. He was beside himself because he said, what are we going to do with Rosenthal china in Africa? But my mother had her own Rosenthal and my grandmother's Rosenthal. I mean, that was just a thing that people, upper middle class people had,
Do you remember or do you know the name of the man who brought the trunks?
Mr. Demling, Demling. I met the family. The principal was off on a job that day, but I met she would have been the daughter-in-law of the man who made the trunks, probably. But yes, I was taken there.
Do you have any other memories from Germany that you want to mention now before we move on to the United States?
I don't have personal memories, only things from stories I've been told, or things I've gleaned, but not personal memories, no.
What are your first memories of America?
Well, I remember that I went to a Russian kindergarten, supposedly. I think, it was a nursery school. And we had a hot lunch every day, and we would curtsy when the cook handed us the plate and say spasiba, thank you, in Russian. So I remember that, and I remember taking naps there. And I do have one strong memory. My mother never mentioned that to me. It's a memory of my own, where mother came to pick me up. I should tell you what she and daddy did when they arrived, job-wise. where she picked me up, that nursery school is near Mount Zion Hospital, which is near Divisadero. Um, and somewhere in that area, there was a Red Cross office. And Mother took me with her because she was trying to get information about her sister Betty. She never stopped trying. And really, I only learned in these last few years. I mean, we knew she was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau with the twin babies, but I had terrible fears about, because that's where Mengele was looking for twins, but apparently they were gassed right away, the mother and children. So none of that happened to them.
Do you have any memories of being in America during the war years?
Oh, lots. Oh, yes. I mean, if you went downtown San Francisco on Market Street, there was an enormous billboard for Camel cigarettes. I think Camels. It may have been Lucky Strike, whatever. And it would change. It would be a sailor or an army or Marine, and there was a hole in the mouth and smoke would come out, you know. But the other thing was that later when I was in elementary school, we first lived on the same block as Aunt Lena and Uncle Max on California Street, not far from Divisadero, kind of just beyond where Pacific Heights is. But in that area, a few blocks further is Fillmore. And during the war years, that became an African American community, you know, because the African Americans came from the South to work in the shipyards. And many of them then lived in that area. It's been gentrified now, everything's different. But my parents' first American friends, we were so proud of the American friends, Uncle Sam and Aunt Betty Marcus. And they didn't have children and they really doted on me and were so good to me. And they would have us to parties. There's one funny story where there'd be a buffet because they were always big parties. And Uncle Sam played the piano. His father had been a physician and his mother was still alive. And I called her Grandma Marcus. Daddy had not seen this kind of buffet ever. So he followed the man in front of him, you know, and he did everything the man did. And there was spaghetti, and then there was Parmesan, and Daddy did that. Well, Daddy did not like that one bit, so he never did that again. But, you know, what do you do when you're in strange circumstances? You follow someone else, right? And Daddy made a joke. Daddy was very funny. But what happened with my father, it was still the Depression when they came in 1938. And he did not have English, really. He learned English on the radio. He'd studied Latin and French. Mother had studied English and Latin, French, and Spanish. I mean, she was very bright, very well educated. So he got a job at what was called Butchertown. And, you know, he was the spoiled baby son of a wealthy family. He'd never done hard work in his life. It was lifting hides, I was told, something like that. Well, he had an accident during the first year. I don't know, he fell with the weight and did something to his back. And he was hospitalized for quite a little bit of time. I remember going with my mother to Franklin Hospital, where actually then our daughter was born, visiting him. And as a result, he was home for about 5 years. So when I came home from school, Daddy was there, and we'd take a walk and maybe do some errands or go to the park. There were some retired men he would talk to on a bench, and I would play. But Mother, like many of the German women, and one of the doctors did not send for his wife till after the war because he wouldn't let her do that. I mean, these were doctors' wives, and my mother, who had college education and had servants, grew up with servants, cleaned houses. And Mother, I remember there was one woman she worked for in a dormant building. My daughter lived in New York. The big thing about a dormant building, there aren't many in San Francisco, but at that time, that building was. And she was sick in bed and watched my mother dusting something. And she said, "Ruth, you've never had work like this, have you?" And my mother said, "No." But after about, and killed my father, after about a year of that, I think, maybe not a year, Aunt Betty, the wife of this wonderful Uncle Sam, who was working at Butchertown and who they helped my parents so much. Aunt Betty got Mother a job in a little specialty store on Grant Avenue, right next to Podesta and Baldacci, which was the primo florist in San Francisco. And it was a small shop specializing in blouses. And Mother did well there, but, it was limited. So she applied for some other jobs, and two came at the same time. One was at a bank, and the other was at I-Magnets. And I think Aunt Betty and Uncle Sam, but Aunt Betty probably urged her to take the job at I-Magnets, which she did. And she worked there for 20 or more years. And she developed her own clientele and sold them designer clothes and so on. And she loved it. And it was hard work, but she was very good at it. And finally, she was carried off the hospital. She later had diabetes, and I think it was an initial, she fainted or something. They couldn't really pinpoint it, but whether that was when she stopped working. And at that point in time, Daddy went back to work when the war ended and worked for my mother's brother, Siegfried, in wholesale linens for hotels and hospitals and so on. And he was on the road a lot, traveling salesman.
How long were your parents able to stay in touch with loved ones they had left in Germany? Once they came to the United States, how long were they able to communicate?
I don't think they were, because, as I said, 2 months later, now, well, not totally. 2 months later, in my hometown in Germany, all the Jews were rounded up, and I'll show you. They were all put not in my grandfather's landmark house, but in my great uncle's house. They put every Jew in the town in that one house. And they called it the Jews' house. I have, pictures of it. So I don't think they heard, and I don't have any letters, but from the Netherlands, there were photographs. Just in going through for this, I've never quite figured out. My Aunt Betty married, turns out, in May of 38. And my parents, everyone, my daddy's mother is there. My paternal grandmother is there. And both Uncle Siegfrieds are there. It was in the Netherlands, and she's wearing a white gown. You'll see it maybe later. So both parts of the family, and in fact, the great uncle and aunt whose house was overtaken were at that wedding. I mean, it wasn't that large a wedding, but and my grandfather was there. Of course, it was his daughter. Um, so those photographs were sent, and then the twins were born, and I have honeymoon photographs from my Aunt Betty. And then I have quite a number of photos of the twin babies. And in 42, they were sent. In the Netherlands, there was a holding camp for Jews named Westerbork, Westerbork. And all the Jews were put there, and from there they were sent. I thought everyone was sent to Auschwitz, which is Auschwitz-Birkenau, was where my aunt and the twins were sent. But I saw some of the other families; they were sent to other horrible camps, and fewer. The future people viewing this should know that the Netherlands lost the largest percentage of Jews. The fewest number of Jews survived in the Netherlands compared to any of the other countries in Europe. Those communities were just decimated. And when my husband and I were in Amsterdam visiting the big, really old synagogue, there was a youngish man leading the group through, and he had real chip on his shoulder. We were obviously Americans, and in those days we each wore suits and that kind of thing. And later, when I learned about this, I realized why he was so resentful, because so few of his people came back.
Let's move now to the United States. You're now in California. How were you received by Americans?
I've been thinking about that. I never experienced what sadly some of the immigrants are experiencing in 2023. People were so welcoming. I mean, I've told you about Uncle Sam and Aunt Betty Marcus, but just generally in school, the kids were, wonderful, and the parents. Later, what happened, we lived on that block, and I went to after I finished the Russian nursery school, I went to kindergarten. It was called Emerson. It's different now. Elementary school was just 2 blocks away. But that area was changing, and Uncle Sam and Aunt Betty were concerned. And they took us on drives on Sunday to look at other neighborhoods to see what might be available. And my parents and they found an apartment in the Richmond, in a court apartment situation. We were upstairs, and it was a very airy, lots of windows, lots of light. I did not have my own room. I slept in the dining room on a sofa, and I had what was the pantry as my playroom with my books and dolls and so on. And I mounted, Daddy loved Life magazine, and I cut out now famous photographs, the big 3 at Yalta, and Rita Hayworth. I know that wonderful photograph I would cut out and paste on the walls of that little pantry. At any rate, because I later became a photographer, we moved, and first grade I was at the Sutro School, which was well, it was like 3 blocks and 2 blocks. But I had to cross. You asked about the war. I had to cross Park Presidio. Anyone who's familiar with San Francisco, that runs through Golden Gate Park through into the Sunset District, and from the Richmond it runs into the marina and towards the Golden Gate Bridge. It's 4, now 5 lanes with a lot of greenery. And there used to be, I think there still might be benches. That's where Daddy sat with the retired men after school when I came home and changed, and we would walk there. When I walked to school, now of course there are signals there. I had to wait for the convoys to go by. There'd be long convoys of Army vehicles going towards the Presidio, I think. So apart from the ads downtown and seeing sailors on Market Street, oh, and we lived across the street from Jeanette's Donut House. And in the window, you could see the machine making the donuts cooking, flopped into whatever dressing and out. But on the weekend, especially, there'd be long lines, mainly sailors, waiting to get in. I mean, one was aware of it, and the street lights on Geary Boulevard and the other main thoroughfares all had a funny cone on top. And at night, I would do it with Daddy. I was so thrilled to do this. We would put shades down because we lived quite near the beach, and any lights might be visible at the beach. And then we collected the tin cans, and Daddy let me smash them, and we'd put them on the corner in a bag on certain days. And Daddy would bring fat. Mother would save fat from cooking, and he'd bring that to the butcher, and it was reused in some way. And of course, there were ration stamps and coins. My parents both used a lot of sugar in their coffee and tea. And they never had enough. And my mother was a wonderful baker. They never had enough sugar ration. So the family often gave them some of their sugar rations to get them through, I mean, it wasn't a, big thing, but it was a nice kind of thing.
How closely did your family follow the news of the war?
Very closely. Daddy listened to all the newscasters every night. They read the paper every day, and he would buy Life magazine. He was just intent on following everything. Absolutely.
Did they ever talk about the events in Europe in front of you?
Not much. And the one thing that I learned, I was a sensitive and very obedient and loving child. If I asked to see the family photographs, and their mother had a couple of albums, I later tore them all out and made it all into one big album. And then she had loose photographs as well. But if that happened, Mother would cry. So I stopped asking, and I would on my own, if I wanted to look at the pictures, I would look on my own.
As a child during the war, how much did you really understand about what was happening?
What a question. I knew it was sad and upsetting for my parents, but beyond, a kid. And it wasn't until as I grew older and began to understand what was really happening or what had happened. And as I said, until really only a couple of years ago, when going back to Germany, I didn't know really, and none of us knew the ultimate fate or those facts.
What do you remember about the death of President Roosevelt?
Oh, I remember very well. I went to a marvelous elementary school, Sutro, and there was we called him the janitor, but I think he did all kinds of handyman jobs around there, and all the teachers were women. I didn't have a man teacher till middle school, and by then the war had ended. In fact, one friend of mine told me that Miss Connolly, who played Country Gardens when we had assembly in the auditorium, was really old, white-haired, very thin. And Fred told me that his uncle had Miss Connolly at Sutro. There were people who should have been retired who came out of retirement to fill the gaps as teachers. But at any rate, there was a rumor that went around that day that President Roosevelt had died, that the janitor had heard it on his radio. And all the way walking those, 2 blocks and 4 blocks, I kept praying, please don't let it be so. I mean, Roosevelt was such a hero in our house. Most of the German refugees really admired him. One family named their little boy Franklin. I'm sure they weren't the only ones, But I got home and Daddy told me, yes, that it had happened.
I just want to clarify one point that you had mentioned before, but I just want to put a little finer point on it. When did your family begin to really understand what had happened to the Jews in Europe under Hitler? When did that all come together and everybody understood it?
Oh, I think the Nuremberg trials. And actually, one of the German, my parents always called him Banker Simon. He'd been a banker in Germany. His son actually was at the medical school here, Harold Simon, and the sister, the daughter, Edith Simon, who was older than I, was a translator. She went to Nuremberg and was a translator there. But it seems to me that at that time, now there was a woman named Mrs. Oppenheimer who had gone through the camps, who was somehow either related or really knew the Strausses well. And she came to San Francisco after the war, obviously. And I remember a Kaffeeklatsch, one of the ways they socialized, none of them had money and they were all working. And fortunately for the families, in those days, no one worked on Sunday. None of the stores were open and so on. So everyone was free on Sunday. So sometimes there'd be family picnics in Goldgate Park, later with cars in San Mateo Park. But we would go to each other's homes, Uncle Max and Aunt Lena, or my parents, or maybe before he moved to Petaluma, Uncle Siegfried, he remarried Aunt Lydia, but that was, I think, rare. And the women would have baked a lot and made little schnittchen, little sandwiches, usually open-faced, that kind of almost more Scandinavian type thing. But the cakes were always wonderful, and coffee, of course. And they'd meet and have the and they'd use their fine china and silver and so on. In fact, there was a story, my Aunt Lena worked at a horrible store, Grayson's on Market Street. It was like a Learner's or not even pennies, you know, it was really low down. She sold dresses there. And one day, on a Monday or something, she and Uncle Max had a coffee clutch, and of course she cleaned it. She was bare on cleaning. She cleaned everything up, but all her china and everything was still out, and I think some of the cakes. And a woman offered her a ride home, and she said, "Oh, I'd like that," and she invited her up to her apartment. And they lived at a corner apartment with an elevator. It's a very nice building, California and Broderick. And this woman saw this and couldn't believe it, you know, the china and the silver and these cakes. And here was this saleswoman from Grayson. But that had not been her life in Germany, for sure. Oh, did I not finish with Mrs. Oppenheimer? Yeah, and I think it was at Aunt Lena's that this took place. She came for one of these coffee clutches. At that time, you know, I was 10 after the war, so 11, 12, I was in that age range. She and the men went to a different room, and she told them about what had gone on in the camps. But Daddy never talked about it. And I knew it must have been horrible. And of course, later, I did a lot of reading later as an adult. You know, Elie Wiesel, but other, you know, many books on the Holocaust.
When you came to the United States, those first few years especially, but even later, did you personally experience or witness any anti-Semitism or any anti-German sentiment?
No anti-Semitism. And the school I moved to, Sutro, in my class, there were twins who were Jewish, and later in fourth grade, another gal who, both fathers, the twins, Anna Beverly, were pharmacists. They knew each other. They were like family. And we all went to Sunday school together. They carpooled, and we didn't have a car, but they took me. You know, and looking back, that was so tender. Nobody ever said a word. They just would pick me up on Sunday and bring me back. And one of our teachers for sure was Jewish, this wonderful sixth grade teacher, Mrs. Raphael. And later, junior high, I was in the, I mean, I'm sorry, it comes off as being pompous, but I was in the advanced group, and we were all in classes together in junior high. And almost all of us were Jewish. And the Jewish holidays, those teachers just stopped, you know, if they didn't really assign any new work. So I was in an environment that was comfortable. Now, anti-German, I remember elementary school, there was a little boy, and I don't think he was Jewish. His first name was Herman. And I remember one day on the street walking home from school, the other children yelling, "Herman, the German." And I mean, that was the worst thing that anybody could be, but they never said that to me, who was a German, you know.
You had mentioned a few moments ago your mother checking with the Red Cross. What was she able to learn from the Red Cross at that time?
Nothing.
How did your parents deal with these losses?
Rough. I think Daddy internalized it a lot. He and I went to Sabbath services, in the daytime with his older brother. We would walk there. It was very near, 3 blocks from our house. The brother that converted to being more observant. And I once asked Daddy, he never joined in the singing of any of the songs. And I remember once asking him why, and he said, maybe when the war is over, I'll do that. But that was like the only thing, he ever said. But there was such love, I cannot describe it, that he had for his mother and his father. I'll show you his father's ashtray. His father died when he was 18. Daddy was a terrible smoker, 2-3 packs a day, but he never crushed a cigarette. And it's marble and it has a bronze wolf on it, fox or wolf. He had a glass ashtray that he put inside there. There was this great respect. But the 3 brothers, they all, and my mother hadn't had a mother. And there was this wonderful feeling between my grandmother and my grandfather, because each of them had raised children without a partner. I mean, my grandmother, 2 of the boys were the boys were pretty much grown, but my grandfather really raised those children on his own. So there was this admiration for each other, because family was so important, But there was such so what the 3 brothers did is something, as a child, I could never understand it. They knew she'd been killed, that she died. And I think after the war, they decided, in Judaism, we say Kaddish for our departed on the day of death. I mean, it sounds bizarre, but that's what we do. We light a candle, the memorial, and usually some of us go to services and the name is read out loud. Well, the 3 brothers had no date of death. And for most of the Holocaust victims, there isn't a date of death. Yes, for some there is, but it's a year maybe. For Aunt Betty, with the twins, it's a year, but I don't know the date. So the 3 brothers decided that on her June birthday, they would light a candle and say Kaddish. And as a child who I still adore birthdays, I thought it was so terrible. But you have to do what seems right and appropriate.
You had mentioned to me previously, before today's interview, that survivor guilt was an issue in your family. Could you please elaborate on that?
I don't know how to put that in words. I think my mother just carried such burdens about her sister and those twin babies. My mother, I've already said she was the middle one, and they lost their mother when they were all children. And she was a worrier. She worried till the day she died about her brother. And would he, he would come see her, and he was absent-minded. And you have to have your keys and your wallet and your glasses. Those are the 3. Anyway, and she worried about everything and everyone. And, there was no resolution with this really. I went through a bad time with my mother at one point after we moved here. I was grown when I was raising my children. And I had some counseling, and it was a very wise woman who worked with me, and she said, "You should go up there and talk to your parents, and your mother should get some counseling," which, of course, she should have had. I mean, just such a bright woman, and it might have opened some doors for her or something. So I did that. I flew up, I met with them, I suggested this, and she was adamant. Daddy kept saying, "She's a good girl, she's a good girl, she's fine." And Mother said, I don't know if it was that meeting or another time, she said it would just be too painful and it would be too much, and she couldn't deal with it. So she never did have. Now she wrote stories. She went back to school after she stopped working. She went to the Fromm Institute at USF. She took French, which she loved. She had taken French, and took fiction writing, and wrote some stories. And what I am sorry about is that we never got her a keyboard. She should have been playing the piano. And then later she had a stroke, and that part became impossible. She couldn't ever write stories again. The words didn't come out right when she'd write.
What do you remember about hearing about Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Well, being in San Francisco, I mean, of course, the whole country, but here we were at the edge and on the Pacific. And obviously, it was the end of the war in the Pacific. But my parents had already been so happy about VE Day, which happened on my birthday, May 8th. And it was Harry Truman's birthday as well. But the ramifications, the moral implications about the bomb really weren't discussed at that time, certainly not by my parents.
Earlier, you mentioned you were aware of the Nuremberg trials. What do you remember about the trials?
Just newsreels. I went to the movies when Daddy was still, home not working. He and I would go to the movies every Saturday. And if there was a birthday party, I would go to the birthday party. And part of the birthday, whether it was the twins or Beverly or some of the other children or my birthday, it was always the same. It was maybe some games, pin the tail on the donkey, all of that. So, looks so retro now. And musical chairs was a big thing. And then lunch. And then after lunch, a big birthday cake and ice cream. And all the other children would have cake from a bakery. And across the street from us, there was Mueller's Bakery. And I would look in the window and see these frosted chocolate cakes with the names and the roses. I'd be so jealous. And I remember with the twins' birthday, and their mother would I would hold my breath that I could get one of those roses. And actually, those roses don't taste very good, but they're so pretty. And my mother did not do that. I did that for my daughter, a 3-layer chocolate cake with a real fudge. We made the fudge frosting. and I did that for years for both my children. Um, but mother would make an Apfelkuchen, apple cake that had a Mürbeteig dough. It's really like a cookie dough. It's delicious, and whipped cream. Or I'm sure they did ice cream because of the birthday party. Um, and everybody was happy with that. One of my Sausalito friends, when I was first married and Milton and I lived there, was quarantined with her little boys. I don't think it was flu, it was some other scarlet fever or something ghastly. And Kathy couldn't leave the house. Of course, the boys couldn't. And so I baked an Apfelkuchen and I brought it and I put it by her front door. And we still laugh about that because she loved that cake. So that's what I would get for my birthday.
What do you remember about the birth of the state of Israel? And what did that mean for your family?
This is going to be a really unusual response. Seder night, one of the things, Passover, when we celebrate Passover and have the Seder dinner and go through the story of the Exodus, one of the phrases that's repeated is next year in Jerusalem. My daddy could have cared less. They never went to Israel. They did go to Germany, and my mother went to France. I think they must have been thrilled for all those displaced people to have a home. But as to for themselves, and I do remember Daddy at the outset saying, they'll never be able to bring Hebrew back. I mean, it's a dead language, the prayer book. But of course, it worked. So it's an unusual, but he was obviously not a Zionist. No.
Can you tell me a little bit about the education you were able to get and the work that you did?
I was very fortunate. I've already said the elementary school was wonderful. The middle school was fantastic. In fact, my high school, I went to what is still a very special high school in San Francisco, Lowell High. It's a college prep, and it's the oldest college prep west of the Mississippi or some such thing. And in the early days, they didn't have girls. Lowell started in the 8th grade, but the 9th grade. But I love Presidio and my friends, the junior high, middle school today. And so I didn't want to leave, and I stayed through 9th grade. In retrospect, I would have had a happier time in high school had I gone 9th grade, but I didn't do that. So I went to Lowell and took my college prep courses and had mostly good teachers. I must say, not as good as maybe, even though it's such an outstanding school, but I had I loved math and did very well in it. Horrible geometry teacher, Mr. Baker. And that was the end of math for me. I was going to go on to calculus and all those things, but I didn't because of Mr. Baker. But I took German there and continued with my French. And possibly because I went there, I was accepted at Stanford. I applied, I had been skipped in 1st grade, but I wasn't skipped a year. At that time in San Francisco, there were half semesters. So I was in a winter something. So I graduated, for example, from the junior high in January, something like that. And I graduated from high school also in January. And so I applied. Of course, it isn't the normal, it isn't for the September acceptance when there's a large class. But there were 4 girl dropouts. So there were 4 girls admitted in the spring, and I was one of them. And the other one is a friend to this day. And she went to the other high school in San Francisco, Jeannie Hotchkiss Powell, to Washington, where my friends from Presidio all went. She and I spent the first weekend together in a room in this old dormitory. Had been a men's dorm, actually. Branner was turned into a woman's, and I don't know, it's gone back and forth. But we were the only ones there. We were taking, English to see if we needed remedial and a couple other aptitude things to place us in classes. And Daddy, her parents were there. She was also an only child. And Daddy and Mommy had made kind of a care package, which was a good thing because the cafeterias weren't open. And among other things, Daddy was big on, we always had a lot of sausage, Wurst, German. And my children called it Opa sausage. Opa is German for grandpa. So we had that sausage and other things. So she and I really bonded that night because there were all these sounds we heard and creaky. And it's this funny old place, and we were all by ourselves. But we made it through, and then we remained friends for all these years. She actually never lived. She married in Seattle. She now lives in Boulder. And she's moved around a lot. So I did graduate. I met my husband during my senior year, actually at a bar mitzvah. It was all set up. And I never went home on the weekend. I had been so overprotected. And I made a pact with my parents that I would not, it's 30 miles, I think, from Stanford to San Francisco, that I would not come home on the weekend. But Mother promised me a dress for Magnans if I would come home for this bar mitzvah. It was their best friend's son, Franklin. And they had an older daughter. She was a year younger than I, Margaret, who became a doctor. Anyway, so I went. Well, Milton, it's a long story that I won't go into. It's too long. It's wonderful. But he became a friend of the manager of the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, and they would ride in Golden Gate Park, horses together. And Milton was a bachelor. He was 30 at that time. And Edmund and Bianca would invite him to dinner as their bachelor when they had to fill out a table at the palace. So at any rate, Bianca was back east, and Edmund brought Milton to this bar mitzvah. So we were introduced. And then Milton called the next day, but Daddy had already brought me back to school. Monday was Memorial Day, and I actually had classes, but he invited me to go fishing at Half Moon Bay. So I went. I cut a 1 o'clock class, and we had dinner at Half Moon Bay and so on. And my parents called because he called them, and I was already gone, and so they knew what was happening. And so Mother was dying to know what had happened. And I said, well, it was very nice. We went fishing, but he didn't catch a fish. My mother burst out laughing. He kind of said, you fool. Of course, he caught a big fish that day. He courted me that summer, and we were engaged in the fall, and then we were married in January. We married before I graduated. but I did finish. It was important to me and to him.
You have a family. What have you told your children about your childhood experiences?
They were very close to my parents as little children because they saw we lived in Sausalito and my parents came often, and especially when my daughter was little, my daughter would stay overnight with them. And later, when my daughter also went to Stanford, and she would see my parents. And David, our son, went to camp one year in Santa Cruz Mountains, and he stayed first for a week with my parents, and then they took him to the camp. So they had, and my parents, once we moved here, came down every few months. So there was a good, and I spoke to my mother every day, and we wrote each other. While I was at Stanford, she wrote me a lot, and I wrote her. We were such a tight family, we had the three of us. What they knew about my childhood, I can't really say. I mean, I didn't ever hold anything back, but kids are more interested in what they're doing, than in what you've done when they're young. But they've each been back to Lüdinghausen with me. And they're very aware. My son called this morning before I nixed the phones. And, knows about this. And my daughter's the one who pushed me on this. She was at me. She tends to be a nag. She's going to see this. Oh, dear. But she kept saying, you have to get in touch. Well, maybe it's a good thing I'm bringing this up. She wanted me to get in touch with the Shoah Foundation and do this. And frankly, I have never felt worthy of being called a survivor. And yet, if I think deeply, which I don't want to do because it's so painful, I would have had brothers and sisters. I would have had a large extended family had it not been for, we would have had a different life, my little family. But I can't think about that. I have to think about the good things and how fortunate we were to get out and then make a life. My parents made a life for us. So she finally did it, and then I followed through.
You mentioned you've been back to Germany.
Oh, yes, 5 times to Germany, yes. There were reasons. The first time was Milton and my first trip to Europe, and we ended in Germany. Yes, we ended in Germany, and we stopped with a friend of my father's, Schulze Hobling, Walter Schulze Hobling. It's like a squire, Schulze. And we stayed in his moated castle that had been in his family since something like 13th century. He had a stained glass window of his forebears that was from the 13th or 14th century. It had the dates. They were Catholic. And he and his wife never had children. His mother lived with them. And when the Nazis, of course, the Catholics had a bad time, many of them. When the Nazis came to power, the Nazis took over that castle. And Walter Schultze Hubling, his wife Ursula, and the mother moved up to the same thing was true of my grandparents' house. The top level was always where the servants lived. So they lived there, and they had buried their silver in the forest. And luckily, they made it through the war. Well, he signed some papers for my father so that my father did get some kind of pension in Germany, whether it was because of the injury he suffered, which he would never have suffered had he remained in Germany, because he would never have done hard labor. Well, he would have in the camps, yes, but not without Hitler. At any rate, they also came to the States and visited La Jolla. They stayed with my parents. My parents drove them, I think, Lake Tahoe and Yosemite and to La Jolla, and they went to New York on their own. My parents went to Germany once together. Mother went once on her own later when Daddy had died. Milton and I stayed with them, and they drove us around, and they actually drove us to the Strauss house. And we got out of the car, but I couldn't, at that point in time, I couldn't pull myself together to knock on the door. Now, the next time I went was with my daughter. She was leading a trip, business, wine trip. And I was she wasn't married, I was her date. And we then went on to Germany, and we went to, that's the only time I've been to my mother's hometown, Fürstenau. But she and I went there and made contact. We wrote letters ahead of time, I did, to the mayor and city manager. I didn't know what to do, explaining who we were, and could we see things that were pertinent to the family. So we went to the city hall in Fürstenau first, and they were totally puzzled and didn't know what to do. But one man said, "Oh, I know." And he called a young man, a teacher, who turned out to be this very idealistic young man. His wife worked for the church. They had young children. And he, every year, took his class to the Yad Vashem in Israel. And he taught about the Holocaust. And he took us around. And he knew a lot. When we look at the pictures, I'll tell you one of the stories he told me about my aunt. So we did that in my mother's hometown, and we saw the outside of her home, but not inside. And the mayor and the city manager did meet with us then and took us around, and they showed us the land that my grandfather had still owned after the war, and which my uncle had sold back to the city, and where there were newer houses had been built there. Uncle Siegfried, the older brother of my mother. Then Julia and I went to Lüninghausen, and we had hotel reservations there. We went to the Strauss house, because I knew the address. And I was a photographer at one point in my life. And I was taking pictures in the garden of the house and the garden and what have you. And all of a sudden, the front door opened, and a young man in a cap came out and smiled and greeted us. And then I kind of explained that it was my family that had the house. To this day, there's an AS05, Alexander Strauss, my grandfather, in 1905, when that house was built, on the chimney. So he said he was just leaving for milk, that he and his partner were about to have tea, and wouldn't we have tea with them? Which was so nice. I mean, I had started crying, you know. So Julia and I went in and saw the inside, the downstairs of the house, with these deep reveals in the windows and kind of marble at the base of the windows. I mean, everything was beautiful. They had done a modern kitchen, and they were very nice. And I later sent them some CDs. Well, that was the second time. Then the third time I went, I've been involved with contemporary art. I studied art history at Stanford, and I had been a docent and all kinds of things involved. I was a volunteer in the arts, contemporary art. And two of my La Jolla friends and I followed Christo, the artist, and it started with running fence. My daughter was at Stanford at that time, and she wrote a paper about running fence before it happened. She met with some of the people who were involved. So she was dying to work on running fence. But that was the year she went to Florence, Stanford and Florence. Well, I said, Julia, it's just not possible. But what you and I can do is we'll go up ahead, and we'll go up there and we'll spend a couple of days, which is what we did. And we walked the roads, and it was the art high of my life. And you could hear the fence and you could see the fence and so on. And I was converted to Christo at that point. So my friends here, Larry, who was a curator, and Isabel, who ran a gallery and wrote for one of the papers, were working on the project. They're in fact in the movie about the project. Well, then from then on, the three of us went to the dining rooms full of Christo project photos that I've taken. The three of us would go. Well, Christo was wrapping the Reichstag, and it was very unusual circumstance. It never would have happened, but Sir Norman Foster, the great British architect, was remodeling the Reichstag, and it was all torn up. So the powers that be said, yes, you can do it during this time period. Well, the three of us went ahead because we like to see the process. And then Isabel and I went to Prague in between by train for a few days, and then came back because there are delays and so on. And we like to see them getting ready. So we saw some of that, and then we saw, of course, Wrapped. And we spent a few days, and at night it was wonderful. Thousands of people came from all over the world. And I spoke to some people, they came by plane, and the planes were all full going into Berlin because it was only this 2-week, it might have been a month, but I think it was a 2-week window. At any rate, I thought as long as I was in Berlin, I would then go to Lüdinghausen and then go to, it's a long train trip because Berlin is in the upper eastern corner and Lüdinghausen is far west, So at any rate, I did that. I went by train to Lüdinghausen. I had this hotel reservation. Well, my husband called us in Berlin, called me, and said, "You're not to stay in the hotel. The young couple called hoping to speak to you. They want you to stay with them in your grandfather's house." And so, of course, that's what I did. For I don't know if it's 2 nights or 3 nights. It's wonderful. And the young man took me around and I met a few people. He kept showing me this one house and saying, not my grandparents, a different house. Doesn't this look familiar? And I'll tell you when I show you a picture of it why he said that. And I said, no, it doesn't look familiar to me. But at any rate, that was my third trip. Then I woke up one day, and I'm very close to both children, but I'm very close to my son, who is not married, and who's very sensitive and cares about history and family. And I thought, David's never, Julian's been there. David's never been there. So I called David and I said, how would you feel about going to Germany, going to Lüdinghausen, seeing that? And he said, oh, he would love it. Well, what we did, we actually spent 10 days, we flew to Berlin, you don't care about my itinerary, but we had a marvelous 10 days in Berlin. And then flew, because I had already done that long train trip. And when you catch an inner Europe flight, it was very inexpensive. So we flew to Cologne first, I think. Yes. Because I skipped something. When I went on the Christo trip and then went to Lüdinghausen, then by train I went to Düsseldorf, which is in the west there. It's a banking center. It has the most Japanese of any city in Germany. And American has always had a flight direct from Düsseldorf. So I took that flight directly to, I think it must have been LA, and then came to San Diego. Well, I had a day or two in Düsseldorf and wandered around, with my cameras. And I was in the old town, and there was a very handsome marble-faced building. And I saw a poster on this building for Maus, M-A-U-S. And that's a book that won the Pulitzer. Now I'm blocking his name, the author's name. It'll come to me, sadly, but anyone can look it up. He won a Pulitzer for it. His father for sure was a survivor and gone through the camps. And what he did, he wrote really a graphic novel before graphic novels were a thing. And the Nazis were the Jews were rats. Forgotten now which is which, cats and rats. Anyway, and it's been banned. It's been on lots of now with this new banning wave that's hit our country. In many places it's been banned. Meanwhile, it's facts, and it's told in a way that children can understand. So Art Spiegelman, and he wrote a follow-up to it as well. But I thought, why is a poster for Maus here in this place in Düsseldorf? So I went over to the building, and it had, some titles and plaque on the door. And I went in, there was a lovely woman at the desk, and I introduced myself. Well, it was the Jewish Library and Research Center, and it had been the SS headquarters. So then another woman, and to my dying day, I'll never forget, it was a Sunday afternoon and it was mid-afternoon. It was time for a coffee clutch. And this woman came who was the librarian. She was leaving, but she was in a flower dress and she was carrying a bouquet of flowers. She was obviously going to friends. But she said, "No, I'll take you in the library." So I gave her some of the names of our family. And she found Betty Manco's name and just a date, my mother's sister. But beyond, and there were a lot of books and a lot of names. But she said to me, and what's strange is Ludinghausen and Cologne, and Ludinghausen and Dusseldorf, it's equidistant. They're the same distance apart. She said the library and research center in Cologne would have more information about your family. So I never forgot that. And I worked out, and I'd not ever been to Cologne, and there's a lot of art there and so on. So we flew from Berlin into Cologne, and I told David while we were there that we would do sightseeing museums. So in fact, we went to a chocolate museum, I think. But that one of my focus was on the research center there. And he immediately said, "We're going there today, the first day, right away." So the hotel kind of told us where it was. We got a little lost, but we got there. And they were very nice. They had an audio cassette that David could take around that would take a couple of hours because there were photographs, and he actually went in the basement where there were still marks from prisoners when they'd been brought, because that building, again, very handsome building, had been an SS headquarters. So he was taken care of, and someone brought me to the second level where the library was, and there was a researcher there. So she immediately knew when I told her, especially about Walter, my little cousin, who is 4 years older than I, born in 1931. His brother, I've already told you, went by Kindertransport because he was older to Britain. Walter was with his parents and his Oma, my Oma, our grandmother, in the Strauss house. Well, on Kristallnacht, some men came in that house and they threatened the family, and they broke every glass and every cup. My uncle, I later saw a letter my uncle wrote. He said Walter couldn't have milk in the morning. There's nothing he could drink the milk with. But what also happened is that they arrested my uncle, and it was on a tax charge, some kind of taxes he didn't pay. Who knows if he didn't, or whether that was concocted. But they did something unusual. They let him take his wife, also Hilda, in his own car to another town, Coesfeld, where there was a jail, because there was no jail in Ludinghausen. So they were jailed then in Coesfeld the day after Kristallnacht. Well, the day after Kristallnacht, all the Jews were rounded up. Meanwhile, that night, the synagogue had been burned and destroyed. It wasn't torn down for years. It's odd. It's in one of the books I have. all of the Jews in the town, and there were at least 22, because there were 22 victims, and there may have been more because one or two got out, were all put in my great uncle Hugo's house. And that's the house that the young man brought me by and said, "Do you recognize this house?" Because then it's a very nice house, you know, but it's a family house. And with 22 people, I can't imagine. And they had to stay there till they were sent by train on to the next destination. Many of the older folk, and a lot of these were older, my grandmother, my great uncle, great aunt, and then other great cousins and so on, were older. And most of those older folk were sent to Theresienstadt. And my grandmother died like 2 weeks later in Theresienstadt. And the last I was sending letters like my mother. And I did get an answer from a professor who was working in the Theresienstadt archives. And he said that Julie Jonas Strauss had died 2 weeks after she arrived. And then he said the sanitary conditions were so terrible. And what he was talking about really was the trains. And my father, I mean, you all know that people were put on these cattle trains. Here was a woman who had servants and bathrooms, and, you know, no bathroom on that train. And mushed up with all these people and the little boy. So she died 2 weeks later. My father always said that she died on the train. And in a way she did. And I think for him, it was a kind of, he wanted that to happen, for nothing worse than that to happen to her. So that was her fate. And I, you know, finally learned it. But out of what happened to her first, before Theresienstadt, she was sent to Cologne, the nearby city, to a Jewish old folks home. And little Walter was sent to Cologne to a Jewish orphanage. And from there, they were sent on. Now, what I never understood was we knew, and that's the plaque for Walter shows, he died in Minsk. Well, Minsk is, I don't know if it's Belarus, I think now. We think of it, or I think of it as Russia. How did he end up there? Well, the minute I told her his name and the orphanage and what have you, and she looked it up, she said, "This is terrible." She said there was a movie about this in Germany. Basically, I think I should tell whoever might be watching this into the future. They put those children on a train to Minsk with other people, and they were taken to a forest. I reread it in German last night. And in the forest, there were like 50 Nazis with machine guns waiting. And they had a record player, and they were playing music very loudly so that the villagers wouldn't hear the screams. And those victims had to first, martyrs, whatever you want to call them, poor souls, had to take all their clothes and anything else off and jump into a pit that apparently Russian prisoners had dug, a huge pit. And they were killed there. And of course, I think that someone crawled out. Either that or the Russians had witnessed it. I mean, there was a witness who knew what had happened there. But imagine an 11-year-old boy all alone, not with his family, and then that horrible scene. That's how he died. And I read that later the Germans buried that, dug it up, and burned the bodies, and then put more dirt on it so that nothing could be found. So that's how Walter ended. And my uncle, apparently, Siegfried Walter was his favorite. Alfred was, I think, kind of a wild child, the older boy. And on his deathbed, he went to Petaluma, this elegant man. He had a chicken ranch, Sebastopol, really. And on his deathbed, he had a heart attack and died in his early 60s. His second wife, Lydia, said he kept calling out for Walter. So, you know, these things stay. They just never go away. I'm sorry. But the people in Cologne, oh, so then after she told me this, she asked me whether I knew about the Stolpersteine. It translates as being stumbling stone. It's kind of awkward in English. I have no idea. So she handed me a very nice little brochure. And basically, what the Stolpersteine project is, a classically trained sculptor German, Gunther Demnig, is behind this project. He began in Cologne. He was classically trained at some of the really great art schools in Germany. He stumbled upon the fact that gypsies lived in a certain area in Cologne. And I think, he was either a student or a starting out artist starving artist. I think he demarcated those locations with string or something. But it got some attention. And furthermore, he realized that German Jews had lived in a lot of places and then were killed the way the gypsies were taken and killed. So eliminated, whatever. So he started looking into that, and he came up with this bronze plaque. It's about that big. It's square. It always has the kind of same format. The name, the date of birth, and the date of death, and maybe the place of death, which is often a concentration camp. Now, with my aunt, he did send Aunt Hilda. Oh, I didn't tell you about that yet. Anyway, he has done those at some point 10 years ago. I already done 50,000 of them, not just in Germany. He did them in France. He did some few in Italy, but he's done them all over Europe, probably also in the Netherlands. So she gave me this. I read it. I understood it. Conceptual art is something I love. My favorite. Christo, in a way, does conceptual type work. So Dave and I arrived in Ludinghausen kind of middle of the day, and went to the hotel and called. We were supposed to call the mayor, and we called him. And he said, we're going to pick you up. And I don't know, he gave us a breather to change clothes or whatever. And he and another man took us to a wonderful bakery coffee shop. And he made us order one of the fancy bakery goods. And we sat down, we were starting to enjoy this, and a young couple came in and joined us. And Peter and Bärbel Zimmer, both teachers. He Jewish, but really didn't grow up that way. His father was Hungarian, I think. And she had looked into his family history. And even while the father was still alive, I think took the father and Peter to their original home and all kinds of things. I mean, she is just an avid historian and just dedicated to what she does. So they had no more than sat down, and she looked at me and she said, "How do you feel about the Stolperstein?" And I thought, oh, I know what that is. And I had it in my purse. I said, oh, I have this brochure I can get. She said, no. How would you feel about having the Stolperstein here in Lüdinghausen? And I said, oh, but would the townsfolk go for that? And what I didn't know at that time, people like me, families of martyrs or victims, whatever you want to call them, would not be able to hire Gunter Demnig to do that. He demands that it come from the people who live in the area. And they pay him, it's not a lot, but they pay him a fee. So I was on track with that about what would the townsfolk feel. So she said, well, we're working on that. And the wonderful mayor, who is also an idealistic person, and she and her husband and a couple of the other people, kind of like a committee, were working with the town at that time. And a year later, they accomplished it. And I was called, and the artist was kind of, because his schedule is very packed. And in fact, I don't think he was able to finish all 22 that day. And he had to come back. He had to book another day for him to finish. So I said to my husband, I can't afford to go back again. And Milton said, you have to go. And so, of course, I went. And I decided Julianne should really go with me. So she came for not quite as long. She joined me. And there were many events that were fabulous. There was a banquet at the historic hotel, and Gunther Demnig was there. I met him, and I said to him, this is a conceptual art project. And he grabbed my arm, and he's a big, strong man, really tightly. He said, yes, that was my whole, idea, and so on. And anyway, there were all these events, but the capping event was on the Sunday, I think, Saturday, Saturday it must have been, that Gunther Demnig installed the plaques. And what we did, they began, now I don't know if this is the time where I should stop and get the book and show the pictures. No, all right.
We'll show the pictures later.
Okay. So it began actually at the Strauss house, and in the book, that's 1, 2, and 3. 1 is my Oma, my grandmother. 2 is my aunt. 3 is my cousin. And the 3 plaques are there at the entry. My aunt, I didn't finish that story. They were taken to the jail in Coatesville the day after Kristallnacht and jailed. And my aunt, something like a week later, hung herself in the jail. My mother always said she was quite a beautiful woman and, slim and blonde. My daddy loved her. She was a kick, I guess, and she smoked cigarettes and, very sophisticated and what have you. And my mother said that one of the maids had gone to help her do that, whether she brought her the wherewithal or, I don't know. But they did let my uncle out, and she was buried in Crefeld, where she was born. And the tombstone is just very simple. It's just, here lies Mrs. Hilda Strauss. I think maybe her maiden name, Zervos. And that's it. The dates, birth and death. The years. Anyway, so she died. And my uncle was kept there a while longer, and then they let him go. I think whether some of it was pity, his wife had died and he had these 2 boys. So what he did was to go to Britain and pick up his oldest son, who'd been sent there on the Kindertransport Alfred. And they then came to San Francisco, where the 2 other brothers were. Now, to my dying day, and I read it, and in the book about all that, it also says, no one knows why he didn't go to Cologne for his little boy, because in 38 or 39, because this might have been 39, because it was November of 38, Walter was still in the orphanage, and his mother was still in the old age home. They weren't sent on till 42. And why he didn't do that or how it came to be, but he did go to Britain, got Alfred, and came to San Francisco. And as I said, on his deathbed, he was still calling out for his youngest son. So that was their story. But the weekend of the installation of the Stolpersteine, there were additional, besides the sculptor and his assistant, because what they did, they dug out a square wherever they went, and they had concrete, and they put the concrete, and then they put the brass plaque on, it was the whole thing. But there was a woman who sang one of our most serious prayers that usually, oh dear, that's, we only say on Yom Kippur. It's not, everyone said the Kaddish at each stop, but they also, the Rachmon, you know what I'm searching.
The El Mole Rachamim.
El Mole Rachamim. And she sang that first, and then we all said the Kaddish in Hebrew. And I explained because the townsfolk came and circled and were so interested. And I explained that even the Kaddish doesn't talk about death, it praises God, and it's not in Hebrew, it's in the language that Jesus spoke, I'm blocking it now. Anyway, so we went around the town block by block, or where the houses were, where people lived, and then were remembered. But the next day, every year in Ludinghausen, there is what they call the Bront procession. It's pronounced a little differently in German, but it's written with a Z, but it's procession. And Bront is fire. And there were a series of fires in the 13th and 14th, maybe even the 12th century. In the main Catholic church we were taken to see it, we could see the marks on the walls of those old fires. So this procession is kind of wonderful because the Catholics come out of their church and the Protestant Lutherans, come out of their church and they join together with the priest and the minister, and they go to the central market square, and there are chairs set up there. And the priest and the minister both spoke, and the mayor spoke. I don't think Gunther Demnig didn't stay for that day. He didn't speak. But some of us, there were about 5 of us, descendants of the martyrs, whatever, came from all over. A woman came from Australia. A man came from Britain who maybe his grandfather had been a good friend of my father's, and they played cards together. I told him I knew that. So there were a handful of us who came from all over the world, and we were each asked to speak. I don't know that he spoke, but I gave it a lot of thought, and I actually met with our rabbi. He didn't have a lot of input, but he was really touched. But I had already made up my mind. There is it's really a poem that we say every year on Yom Kippur, our day of remembrance of mourning. But it's said at other times. It was actually written by a woman and a local rabbi, Jack Reamer. We remember them. And I have it typed out, and I'd like to end my testimony today, later, with it, because it says so much, and I think it touches so many hearts. I said it in German. I decided to do that the last minute. Somebody else was going to do that, and I said, no, I will do that. And the people from the town just came up to me. What had also happened all during this period was the newspaper for that region, not just for Ludinghausen, for the region, had been running articles for months. In fact, the wonderful mayor went to Bärbel Zimmer, the teacher who was the inspiration for all this, when the article started. And I think my grandmother was the first one with a photograph in an article. That was the first one. Anyway, there were a series of articles, and he was such a sweet man. Joseph Holtermann, he was a 5th generation baker and had the bakery in the adjoining hamlet, and he had a watercolor of my great-grandfather's house made for me, so I'll show that later. Anyway, he called Bärbel and he said, Bärbel, these stories are so sad and terrible. Is this gonna just go on and on? And she said, oh, some good ones are coming. So then I don't remember, the sequence, but among other stories, I had sent her a lot of photographs which she used in the book. My family had 3 trunks. Now, have I already told? Yes, I've already told the story of the 3 trunks, right? Okay. Well, I kept the one trunk and I had taken photographs and sent it to Bearable. So she wrote that up, and that was a happy story. And then the story of my great uncle, the oldest of 3 brothers, just like my daddy and the 3 brothers, his father, there, and 2 uncles, there were 3 brothers. And the oldest of those brothers was a veterinarian. And he was the one who he married a Christian, not a Catholic, a Protestant woman, not till really later, almost the war years, but mixed marriages is what the Nazis called it. And that was as bad as it could get. So both of them were on terrible lists. So he had been practicing veterinary medicine in Dortmund, where actually my daddy's uncles from his mother's side had a department store, big department store. It was bombed during the war, and that was the end of it. So Dortmund is a city nearby, and that's where he was practicing his veterinary medicine. Well, when all this went down, he came back to Ludinghausen, and Mr. Pike, P-E-I-K, hid him, and everyone knew. He was hidden on a roof, and he would walk at night. People could see, it wasn't that tall a structure. People could see it. No one turned him in. And later I'll show a photograph on his 80th birthday. There was a huge celebration. He was surrounded by floral tributes, So there were a few good stories, and they were printed in the paper and then included in this book. Now where am I going? Oh, so that ceremony was quite wonderful. My daughter was mad at me. The Catholic priest especially gave a very moving, it was short to the point, but so moving, an address. And he came over to greet us. And I said to him in German, "Oh, I wish you were my rabbi." Wünsche, dass Sie mein Rabbiner wären. And my daughter, how could you say that? And I said, I meant it. He's just such a heartfelt person, So that was a wonderful occasion. And instead of turning their direction that they always do to the fire and the history of the town, it was all to the Holocaust that year. So the tribute, yes.
I want you to share with me the story of the plaque. You haven't mentioned the plaque.
The plaques?
The plaque. The veterinarian.
Oh, what I have from him, the woman who bought the former Jew's house, what happened, the veterinarian, made it through the war. No one else came back. His brother did not come back. And of course, Alex, the middle brother, had died years before in 1918. 1920. So he, the veterinarian, bought the house of his brother where all the Jews had been put. And he had a little bronze plaque, Dr. Strauss. And the woman who bought that house and lived in it brought it to me. The day, I think it was the day of the Brunt procession. And she wanted me to have it. So I keep it in the dining room cabinet. It's usually propped up against my Oma's tureen because it's brass, and the tureen has a gold rim. So anyway.
You keep referencing a book. Can you explain this book?
The book came out later, maybe a year after. And what Bearable did with the book was page by page, the photographs that she had of the people, all the text that she could put together, the history. It begins with my grandmother. I'm on the cover as a 3-year-old, and on the back, one of the photos she used was the three Strauss brothers in San Francisco. It was on a Sunday. They were in their sports, they used to call it, no tie. So she put all this together, and there are maps on the front of, the inside cover. It's a map of Lüdinghausen showing exactly where, and they made some maps because they ran some docent tours of the Stolpersteine, because people did come to see and wanted to hear, from beyond Lüdinghausen, wanted to hear the stories. So what she did, she basically compiled everything, all the 21 people, the various extraneous things like the trunk or the veterinarian story and so on, and all the photographs. Many of the photographs are ones I sent her from my family album, and the maps. And it's gone into, she wrote me, it's been a while back, it's gone into another printing. So it's had a life, And then I have another book from my aunt's married into town in the Netherlands, Winterswijk. Winter, Winters, Wijk. And it's, near the German border. These towns were near the Dutch border. And I don't know if I've already mentioned my grandfather. I don't think so. I think I told you my grandmother made soup for the laboring mothers for the Catholic hospital in Lüdinghausen. But my grandfather, of course, lived in Fürstenau. Well, he was hidden, Kristallnacht, in the Catholic hospital there in Fürstenau because the nuns knew him. These families were known. They were benevolent families. They did charity. They were involved in the town. He was head of the Jewish congregation, which was very small. It was their cousins and so on. And he had the Torah in his house. So at any rate, he was hidden in that Catholic hospital. The guise was that he was to have a hernia operation. He died, 20 years later, never having had that, on a motorcycle hit by a truck in the city in Holland, in Eindhoven. Anyway, what happened then was on Sunday when the nuns were at Mass, his longtime hired hand who'd worked for the family met him in the garden of the hospital and took him back to his home. He packed and he cut out the oil portrait of his wife, who had died in the flu epidemic, rolled it up, and the Torah, and took the train to the Netherlands to his youngest daughter and lived with that family. Now, that would have been November of 38. And what I've read is the Dutch did not close, or the Dutch didn't do it. The Nazis did not close the Dutch borders until 39. So you see, it was still open for him to board a train and go to Winterswick, which he did, and he lived there. Well, they were all hidden. My aunt and her husband lived next door to his parents. There was a sister-in-law. My uncle had a sister who was married, had children as well. My aunt had twin babies who were born in 1940, a boy and a girl. And all of them had been hidden. And my grandfather, who came to the States in 1951, when I was 16, and stayed with us for a while, and he stayed with my uncle on the chicken ranch, and he went to Golden Gate Park and made friends with the shepherd there and so on. He wanted to walk across the Golden Gate Bridge, and my family wouldn't let him. He was quite a spirited man. Well, when you die on your motorcycle at age 76, obviously. He went to where the twins had been hidden, and they were gone. And he went to where Betty and Bernard, and they were all gone. In the Netherlands, there was a holding camp, Westerbork for all the Dutch Jews. And that's where all of them went before they were shipped to the other camps. But my grandfather escaped that. He continually moved and was hidden by Dutch farmers all through the war. Realize he left Germany in November of 38, and till 45, he was hidden in the Netherlands. At one point, and with that Torah, now what breaks my heart, and the Torah reemerged with our family. My one and only grandchild, my granddaughter, used it for her bat mitzvah some years back. She's now 23, so it was 10 years ago, but I have photos of that. At any rate, my daughter traced it down. At one point, for quite a long period, he was hidden with a Catholic priest. And I kind of wonder, one of the stories I heard was they were all very observant. And on Sabbath, you didn't wear, my mother would never sew on the Sabbath, he would sit with his children in the garden and talk about the Bible on the Sabbath. So, he was learned in that way. And I wonder, all these months with the priest, they must have had some interesting discussions, Now, where are we? I don't know if we're kind of finished, except for showing. And, I've put these things together, and they're things, they're not people, but they're from people, and they carry associations with them. And even though it's silver and china and what have you, and I have banquet cloths, they meant a lot to my parents, because there was that association with from the beloved mother or from the beloved father,
I want to ask you what message you have for future generations who will watch this testimony, and you were going to recite, "We remember them." So shall we do that?
Yes, it's in the other room. I have to.
Okay, well, first give your message, and then we can do the poem later.
Okay. Yeah, I thought I'd really end with the poem. you hinted at that question, so I thought about it. I just hope whoever watches this, whatever boy, girl, man, woman, old, young, that you would be open to the people around you. And if they're different, if they look different or speak differently or have different beliefs or faiths, that you would still be open and not be negative or castigate them without understanding first what makes them who they are as human beings.
Thank you. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Oh, thank you.
What are we looking at here?
This is the house that Alexander Strauss built in Ludinghausen in 1905 that is now a National Historic Landmark in Germany, and the outside cannot be changed. And if you look up towards the top, the downspouts are dragons. It's in the Jugendstil style. It's kind of arts and crafts and Art Nouveau. Inside the tile really looks like that. The friend who copied it from a photograph put me as a 3-year-old looking out from the window.
What are we looking at here?
Here is the house of my great-grandfather, Philip, where Alex and Julie first lived when they were married, and I read that Hugo and Frida lived there when they were first married. It's huge. You can't tell as much from the front. I was in it. Someone bought it and has torn it apart. It's redoing it, but it's like a big rock pile.
And where is this?
This is actually in a hamlet called Zeppenrade, Seppenrade, that is now a part of Ludinghausen. And what happened with the Strausses, Alex and Julie decided they should move to Ludinghausen where the schools were better. It was a real town versus this little hamlet, but now the hamlet in recent years, it's been absorbed and it's part of the city of Ludinghausen. But the mayor who took me around actually also grew up in Zeppenrade, and his bakery was in Zeppenrade.
What are we looking at now?
This is my mother's hometown, Fürstenau, which is not in Westfalen. It's in Hanover. And now it used to be called Hanover. Now it's called Niedersachsen. It's just a different province. It's vaguely the same region. It's a smaller town.
Who are these people?
David or Dietrich Hamburger, my mother's father, and her mother Rose, or Rosa, who died in the flu epidemic. It's either a wedding or engagement picture.
And when was it taken and where?
Fürstenau, where they lived, probably, and I'm not sure, it would be 1908, something like that.
Okay. Thank you. And this photo?
It's my grandfather, Dietrich David Hamburger, with a horse. I thought, that was his life, dealing in horses. And this one was taken before the war.
Do you have an idea where it was taken?
In that region, had to be, but no.
Thank you. And this photo, who are these people?
They're celebrating, and it's my grandfather who did marry, Dietrich David Hamburger. On the bottom row, the furthest left, is the woman he married, a widow, also German Jewish, who was hidden in forests all through the war. And then my grandfather. The rest of those people are her relatives and it was probably in the Netherlands because that's where they lived the rest of their lives, in Eindhoven.
And what was her name?
Elsa.
Thank you.
She didn't hear you.
Who are these people in these photos?
The left photo shows my mother, Ruth Hamburger, later Strauss, and her brother, who was a year older. They're about 12 and 13 there. And the one on the right shows them as adults, Siegfried Hamburger and Ruth Hamburger, before she became Strauss. And they're by a river. I don't know who the other man is.
Any idea what year these photos were taken or where?
Well, the one with them as children, as I said, I think was probably in 1920, early 20s. And this one was as adults in the either late 20s, early 30s.
Thank you. And who is this?
This is Betty Hamburger, later Menko, who married a Dutchman, my mother's baby sister, who died at Auschwitz.
And when was it taken?
Sometime in the 30s, 1930s.
And do you know where?
Probably this one, probably in Germany.
Thank you. And tell us about this photo.
This is a photo of Betty Hamburger, later Menko, with what she loved. She was a playgirl, my mother always said. My mother was the student. She's playing tennis with these men. Now, I don't know if this was, I have a feeling it was still in Germany before she was married in the Netherlands.
Any idea what year that might have been?
Yeah, the late 30s, 37.
Okay, thank you. Can you please tell us about these pictures?
Yes, the photo on the left is Betty Hamburger Menko's wedding photo. She's shown in bridal attire. Her groom is there, her niece on her husband's side. The rabbi is there, but my grandmother Strauss is there, my Oma. And the Strauss, Siegfried Strauss, as well as Siegfried Hamburger, her brother, and my mother, Ruth, is there.
Please introduce us one by one. Who's who? Starting right to left or left to right?
Okay, furthest left is Rose Hamburger, my grandfather's sister, came to take care of the children. Then Dietrich Hamburger, David Hamburger, the father of the bride Betty, the groom Bernard, then his niece, whose name I don't know, and might be his sister. You remember, I was a baby, I never met these people. Behind them, it's a whole melange. And I don't think we need to identify everybody, but my parents are there, Rabbi's there, my grandmother on the Strauss side, as well as my uncle on the Strauss side. I'm pretty sure it was taken in the Netherlands because there's not a single wedding photo of my parents. I've never seen a single one. And maybe, it couldn't be done in Germany in 34. This was 1938, May of 38, that they were married shortly before my family left. On the right is their honeymoon, Betty and Bernard. I do not know where they went, but it's kind of a glamorous, fun 1938 honeymoon shot.
Do you know what country it's from? Okay, thank you. And tell us about these photos.
They're all of my Aunt Betty Hamburger before she was married, all with the same young blonde man, typical Aryan. I have more with him on a boat, and I mentioned this to the man in Fürstenau who took us around, and he told me, I know exactly who that is. I went to his 50th wedding anniversary, and he told me if things had been otherwise, I would have married Betty.
And his name?
I don't know.
And what year?
Well, before 1938, 37, 36, 37.
Thank you. And tell us about this photo.
This is Betty's twins, Rosa and Jacob Minko. And here they must be about 2. They were about 3 when they went to Auschwitz with their mother and died right away.
And what country was this picture taken in?
This was from the Netherlands.
Thank you. Okay, what are we looking at now?
These are various shots of my mother, Ruth Hamburger, before she became Ruth Strauss. And the top one is at the Ursuline Convent.
Which one is she?
She's in the back row in the black. And then in the front, this lineup with her friend, she's the second from the right. And this one is, you can't really tell, she's in the middle. It's in Fürstenau for the Schützenfest, one of the annual celebrations where they all march around, very German.
You know when they were taken?
Well, all of them in the 30s, although the Ursuline Convent was maybe right around 1930. No, would have been in the 20s, because that was her high school, her gymnasium. And these were the 30s, earlier 30s, mid.
Okay, thank you. And what are we looking at now?
On the left they're all dressed up. It's my daddy, Ernest Strauss, then Lena Strauss, then Ruth Strauss, and Max Strauss. And they've come from services, the High Holy Days. And it's when my parents first bought their house, which was a big deal and a wonderful thing. And on the right are the 3 Strauss brothers together. Ernest, Max in the middle, and Siegfried, the oldest, on the right. And that was at a picnic in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. They're both San Francisco and early 50s.
Thank you. And what are we looking at now?
On the left is my grandmother, Julie Jonas Strauss, with Alfred Strauss and Alice Strauss, her older grandchildren, and they were born, because they're about 3-4 years old there. Has to be mid 30s. And on the right is the only photograph we have of my grandfather in the cart. He's here on the right wearing a kind of straw hat.
And his name?
Alexander Strauss.
And when was this taken?
No, before he died, and he died in 1920. That's all I know.
Thank you. And who are these people?
Those are my parents, Ruth, Rachel Strauss, and Ernest Strauss. And they were taken in San Francisco later in their lives.
Can you give me an approximate time?
Yeah, I know. About 1960 for my mother, a little bit, no, after that, no. It would be 1963, and maybe something close to that for my father.
Okay, thank you. What are we looking at now?
The tombstones for my parents, and it's not the usual beloved father, husband, because I kept seeing that in the cemetery. So this tells a little of their story for anyone who might wander by many years from now.
Thank you. What is this?
This is my grandmother and grandfather, Julie and Alex Strauss's tea and coffee service, silver. And I was told by an old silversmith in San Francisco, it was all hand done, that he learned how to do that pattern in Hungary when he was beginning. On the back of the tray, the front has their initials and the date. What's odd is they were married on the 9th of November. And the silver wedding anniversary fell in 1918. 9th of November is Kristallnacht, but it wasn't then. And on the back, there's an inscription, "My good children," because Julie Strauss's mother lived with them, with all the Strausses. Our beloved brother and sister. It's from all their relatives. Alex and Julie Strauss for their silver anniversary, and then the date. So it was a gift from the family. And my mother used it always over the years, and I use it.
Thank you. And what is this?
This is Alexander Strauss's ashtray. I think he smoked cigars, and it's bronze and marble. And my daddy, I think I mentioned earlier, wouldn't put his cigarettes out on that marble. He kept a glass ashtray inside the ashtray. It was kind of reverence for his father.
Do you know when or where it was made?
I haven't any idea. I mean, Germany, but who knows, maybe not. Maybe it was made elsewhere.
Thank you. You wanted to share a poem with us.
Yes, this is what I said at the big gathering in Ludinghausen, the commemoration for the plaques and the Stolpersteine. And it's something that we usually read at Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. We Remember Them by Sylvan Kamens and Rabbi Jack Reamer. At the rising sun and its going down, we remember them. At the blowing of the wind and the chill of winter, we remember them. At the opening of the buds and the rebirth of spring, we remember them. At the blueness of the skies and in the warmth of summer, we remember them. At the rustling of the leaves and the beauty of autumn, we remember them. At the beginning of the year and when it ends, we remember them. As long as we live, they too will live, for they are now a part of us as we remember them. When we are weary and in need of strength, we remember them. When we are lost and sick at heart, we remember them. When we have decisions that are difficult to make, we remember them. When we have joy we crave to share, we remember them. When we have achievements that are based on theirs, we remember them. For as long as we live, they too will live, for they are now a part of us as we remember them.
Thank you. Thank you